Good evening. Welcome to our international speaker series. My name is Angela Zhang. I'm the director of the Philip K. Wang Center for Chinese Law. Today, I'm extremely pleased to welcome two guests, Professor Ariel Ezrachi from the Oxford University and Professor Morris Stuck from the University of Tennessee to join us to talk about their very exciting new book. I just finished this book this afternoon, How Big Tech Barons Smash Innovation. I guess these two professors are so well known in the international competition law community that you don't need any further introduction, but bear with me. I will still read out their profile to you. Just very briefly, Professor Ezrachi is a Slaughter and May Professor of Competition Law at the University of Oxford and the director of the University of Oxford Center for Competition Law and Policy. He is the co-editor-in-chief of the Journal of Antitrust Enforcement and the author of numerous books. You probably have read some of them if you are a competition law student or a lawyer, including Competition Overdose, Virtual Competition, EU Competition Law, etc. I own all these books, by the way. They're all great books. Morris is the Douglas A. Blaze Distinguished Professor of Law at the University of Tennessee, where he teaches antitrust, privacy, business torts, law economics, and evidence. He has over 25 years experience handling a wide range of competition law issues in both private practice and as prosecutor, U.S. Department of Justice. And he had given a lot of testimony and expert witnesses for multiple governments and intergovernmental agencies, including the World Bank, United Nations, European Commission, and the Federal Trade Commission. So I think we are very fortunate to have them to talk to us about the latest book. And I personally really enjoyed this book. It's really easy to read, but at the same time, the book is very deep and very thought-provoking. So without further ado, let me give the floor to Morris and Ariel.
Thank you so much, Angela. It's a real pleasure for us to join you, and thank you for the opportunity to tell you and the other participants a little bit about our book. Let us start. So how we came about to discuss this. A few years back, the European Commission approached Maurice and I after we published our book on virtual competition. And what they wanted is for us to look at digital markets and innovation. And whereas we at the time, as well as most people, had concerns about market power in digital ecosystems, the assumption or the prevailing assumption was that innovation seems to work quite well, because once you look at the level of investment in research and development, you're bound to think that things might not be perfect, but they're doing quite well. But what happened was that we made a few discoveries and we realized that there is a real problem when it comes to innovation in digital ecosystems. And that led us to, we reported that in our report at the time, and that led to further research and people that got in touch with us to further discuss. And eventually we decided to take all the research that we conducted and bring it together under this new book, How Big Tech Barons Smash Innovation. And we want to share with you 5 stories that in a way, give some of the highlights of the book. We'll speak about how innovative is the digital economy. We'll then explain what levers tech barons, those giant companies that control ecosystems, what levers they use to smash and distort innovation paths. We'll speak about the effects of those strategies. And then we'll move to consider what are the limitations of current antitrust enforcement and also current regulation, and maybe share with you some thoughts on the way forward. So the starting point is something that I think our audience should be familiar with. And these are the digital dynamics that are very unique to digital markets. And they suggest that market dynamics are different from what we would expect on the high street. We covered these extensively in the book, but also in virtual competition, in other publications that we had. So I think let's just go very quickly and go to the bottom line. The bottom line is that whereas we have certain assumptions as to the dynamic of competition in the high street, those assumptions are weakened, and at times they collapse completely once you move to discuss digital markets. Most noticeably are extreme network effects, both direct and indirect network effects. The fact that, of course, the market is less balanced in terms of the relationship between users, consumers, and providers because of the asymmetry of data, the asymmetry of analytical power, and the fact that key players who obtain scale positions themselves as gatekeepers. And whereas we tend to think of those key companies as very large companies on the market, those companies were able to occupy a space where the market actually takes place within their ecosystem. So it's no longer companies that are operating on a free market, but occupy a very significant position on that market. These are companies that actually control the markets, control the dynamics of competition, can engage in behaviors or strategies that undermine the flow of competition, and in doing so also undermine the actual flow of innovation. So those companies, we refer to them as big tech barons. And it's important to start by saying that, of course, it's not all dark. There are many benefits that come from and flow from digital economy. We all benefit from it. And of course, big tech barons also deliver benefits. They deliver innovation. But the important thing for us to appreciate is that as they grow in size, they grow from managing a platform to managing interlocking platforms. And eventually, they rise to the position of controlling an autonomy, an ecosystem, where we usually have to enter, have to drive through their roads, pay their taxes, and abide to the laws that they establish. This is very similar to those of you familiar with the game makers from the Hunger Games, the idea that the market space is controlled, the competition is controlled. Also similar to others who might recall the movie The Truman Show. Either way, the understanding that what we have are controlled environments, and in those controlled environments, it is not only competition that is controlled, it is not only the data and privacy that are controlled, it is also the flow of innovation. So let's move to Maurice.
Yeah, so when we were thinking about innovation, how do we, what's the sort of taxonomy of innovation? And when you're looking at the business literature, there are many different types of innovation. And we thought we would focus on two metrics. First is the type of innovation. And is it disruptive? And there, Clay Christensen and his work on disruptive innovation, or is it sustaining? Basically, it's providing current customers with something better than what they currently have, and both can be positive. But then it turns to what's the value of innovation, and this is something that is often overlooked today. That we assume that innovation generally creates value for society, but not necessarily. As what we look at is that innovation can create value, and both sustaining and disruptive innovation can create value. But disruptive innovation generally is assumed to create more value than sustaining. But innovation, besides creating value for society, can also extract and destroy value. And that's something that is overlooked by policymakers, that not all forms of innovation are necessarily helpful. So once you look at innovation through this prism, you can then have a hierarchy. And then we ask, well, who are the true innovators? And normally when, the tech barons, when they testified before US Congress, they identified themselves as not only innovators themselves, but as ones who help fosters others to innovate. But once we look at the tech barons through the prism, we can see that the nature of innovation that they provide varies. Within their ecosystem, generally they will engage and others will engage in sustaining innovation. They're not going to invite people into their ecosystem who will tear it down, right? You wouldn't invite someone to your house who's going to set it on fire. Same thing with the tech barons, is that they will invite within their ecosystem those that innovate, but generally these types of innovations help reinforce. So when you think about Google, for example, it's innovating in terms of search, rather than just typing your search on a keyboard. Now you can search orally by asking Google's assistant. And you might think, well, that's innovation, but it's sustaining innovation, because within that value chain, Google is still going to retain a lot of its power and a lot of the profits. And then the tech barons outside their ecosystem will more likely engage in disruptive innovation. So, for example, when the tech barons go into healthcare, they're more likely to be disruptive because they're going to disrupt someone else's value chain. And one of the things that we'll see is that as a company's market power increases, the value of the innovation will change as well. And Ariel has a nice graph that he'll discuss later on that goes on that point. But just remember that as well, that market power, you're going to see a change in the value. The other characters in our book are whom we call the tech pirates. And by definition, the tech pirates are companies that engage in disruptive innovation that create value. And some of them might have been the tech barons themselves. Like one of the famous examples is Apple. When they came up with the Macintosh, they ran the pirate flag above their headquarters to signify that, they were going to be the disruptors. And some of the tech barons were tech pirates originally, but generally these are firms that are looking to disrupt an ecosystem. And some of them may not even know the full consequences of their technology. But one thing they'll discover then is that if they're seeking to disrupt an industry, and that can affect the tech barons' profits and power, then they're in peril. So it's this interplay between the tech pirates who are seeking to disrupt and the tech barons who are open to this disruption outside their ecosystem, but far less so within their ecosystem. So that is the basic tension that we'll see throughout the book. So what's the effect that this have on innovation?
Yeah, so here, I guess it depends who you ask. So if you ask the tech barons, if you look at what their CEOs say, very much in line with what Maurice mentioned, they will present themselves as the originators of innovation. And of course, as Maurice explained, it is true to some extent. And what they'll do is every time they will harness another theory, it might be Schumpeter, it might be Ariel, but the idea is to show that if you think that they have market power, still market power is what facilitates innovation. If you think that the market is slightly more competitive, well, you know what? That is also a reason for them to innovate. No matter how you look at it, the narrative is very clear. It's a narrative that is actually quite captivating, that we have those coral reefs, we have those ecosystems, and they are the source of a lot of the innovation that we get. And you have here a list of few bullet points, which we refer to them as the ideological platter. These are the things that the tech barons, the lawyers that work on behalf of them, academics, the whole ecosystem that is mobilized to create this narrative that will convince us that any investment should be channeled to them and any intervention would be very harmful to competition. And if you trust this narrative, then you would think that there is no problem, because your assumption would be that whatever they do is a reflection of market forces. And yet what we discovered is that in reality, this tension between the pirates and the barons lead the tech barons to engage in a number of very successful strategies that impact on the ability of pirates to access the market. That is what is happening in the present. The problem is that because we're talking about competition and dynamic innovation, and not just about what is happening now, those strategies also affect our future. And our strategies and policies have so far failed to appreciate those effects. And we use the 1 in 60 rule, which is a rule that is used in navigation that says that for every degree of error in your navigation, for every 60 meters, you will have 1 meter deviation. And we use it just to highlight, it is not that we need a radical change in strategy, but our assumption that the market delivers on its promise when it comes to innovation, on the long run, when you think about the speed of technology and you think about the trajectory, is leading us to a place where we don't want to be. In other words, the innovation we get and the innovation we will get in the future from those ecosystems will not be in line with our desires. Our assumptions that led us to refrain from taking a critical look at innovation are likely to lead us very far from the target, or from, let's say, the desired target. So how exactly do they slash innovation? We set the scene, we explain why we worry. Let's look at the ways in which those tech barons can smash disruption. And they can do it using several levers. I think what we will discuss here are the levers that relate to supply and demand, first of all. So, Maurice, would you like to highlight the various mechanisms?
Yeah. So, I mean, one thing here is that the tech barons cannot force upon us innovations that we clearly do not want, right? So there is some limit to their power. But what they can do is, it's almost like a casino. The casino doesn't always win, but the more you're within their ecosystem, the more likely that the tech barons will kind of nudge us to innovations that may help sustain their innovation and nudge us away from innovations that could potentially disrupt their ecosystem. So if you look at this graphic here, you can see that within their ecosystem, they have the ability to distort the supply of innovation. And we'll give you some examples of that, as well as distort the demand of innovation, basically manipulating us in what innovations we adopt. But then even with outside their ecosystems, they can then distort the supply and demand of innovation. And we'll give you several examples of that. And that has then, if you look then at the bottom, two effects. First, it's going to change the nature of innovation within their ecosystems. And even if you then decide, well, I'm going to avoid the tech barons, I'm not going to use their search engine, I'm not going to use their texting apps, I'm not going to shop on their platforms, I'm going to completely avoid them. You really can't. You can't avoid the effects of the toxic innovation. And we'll give you some examples of that. So if we go then to the first weapon, you might then say, well, how are these tech barons different from past monopolies? And one thing that these tech barons have that earlier monopolies lacked is what we call the nowcasting radar. Basically, a lot of data flows through their ecosystem, and they can then see what we're doing and what apps we're using, how we're using the apps, and they can also see how the apps are changing in nature. And this enables them to identify potential threats. Now, you might think, well, how do you know this? Well, we have a good insight from this. From Congress did a report, and they had access to a lot of the tech barons' documents and internal data. And Mark Zuckerberg, for example, Facebook acquired Anavo. And the interesting thing was Anavo was supposed to help users with privacy. But it turns out because it offered a VPN, a lot of data was going through Anavo, that Facebook could then identify potential threats. And one of the threats that we discussed is WhatsApp. And you might think, how is a texting app a threat to Facebook? Well, WhatsApp was starting to change and was starting to take on more of the function of a social network. And they saw this threat in real time. So in using the nowcasting radar, the monopoly, unlike earlier monopolies, can identify who are potential threats. And once they identify the potential threat, then they can then distort the supply of innovation. And one way they can do so is to copy the tech pirates' innovation. And it's actually, this was another insight that Zuckerberg mentioned, is the tech barons already benefit from network effects. So what that means is, it's really hard for me to shift to another social network unless I get all of my friends and family and acquaintances and schools and everything like that to go to the same social network. So that requires moving a lot of people to another social network. And some of my friends might say, look, you should join this other social network. They have better features. Well, what Facebook recognized is that if they can just copy some of the tech barons' innovations, it doesn't have to be better or even as good. It could be slightly less good, but it's enough to then say, it's not worthwhile for me to switch because so many of my friends are still on Facebook. That then increases then switching costs, and that then benefits them. So because you kind of then say, we're going to then mimic the innovator, that's going to lessen the likelihood of people switching, and they'll stick with us. And that might not seem to you to be that nefarious. It really isn't. I mean, they're just ripping off the tech pirates' innovation. But then they can also reduce interoperability, or they can just simply kick out the tech pirate from their ecosystem. And we have a good example of one tech pirate disconnect, and we spoke with their CEO, Casey Oppenheimer, and he told us the profound effects of being excluded from the ecosystem. It's just like half your business, boom, can just vanish overnight. But besides distorting the supply of innovation, they can also distort the demand of innovation. And here what we did was, there was a famous example by Rogers given on users' adoption of innovation and the different stages. And what we then did was we modified it for the digital economy. And we showed then how on each step of the user's adoption of innovation, how the tech barons can then nudge us away from the disfavored innovation. And one of the key ways is just to make it harder to find the innovation. And then even if you can find it, make it very difficult to incorporate it. And a good example of that is for those of you with an Apple iPhone, you can't get an app outside the App Store. It's just impossible. But for those of you with an Android phone, you can, in theory, sideload an app, but it's really, really hard. And our book talks about how Apple Google not only makes it hard for sideloading, but in fact has with these warnings and the like, really try to scare users from sideloading apps. So that can then distort the demand for innovation. And then we go next to what are the impacts that this could have beyond their ecosystem? And Ariel will talk about some of the ripple effects.
So what we understand now is that the tech pirates basically have the power to distort the supply of innovation. They can distort the demand for innovation. All of this happens within the ecosystem, but of course it has an effect also outside the ecosystem. But as you look outside the ecosystem, you see other effects that are really significant because they change the path of innovation. First thing is, what is the likelihood, if you are now developing disruptive innovation, what is the likelihood of you getting a good investment, getting funding? The reality is that all of the angels or the funds that are likely to invest in you are very careful about making an educated guess as to your likelihood of success. And if you're a disruptor, the term in the industry is you are basically sitting on the elephant path. You're sitting on the path where you will likely be quashed by the tech baron. So unless the strategy is an exit through acquisition, there is no reason anyone will invent in you. And indeed, in discussions that we had with people from the industry, they will shy away from investing in disruptors when those disruptors are trying to take and confront the big tech barons and propose new technology that undermine the value chain that is at the heart of the tech baron ecosystem. Another thing which we're all familiar with are killer acquisitions, and many acquisitions can be directed at trying to identify a disruptor, purchase the disruptor, and then kill the technology. In fact, a lot of those acquisitions, when we have technologies that are being shelved after an acquisition, the purpose could be either to deprive another company from getting access to that technology or simply just eliminating a disruptor. Some of the strategies there are aimed at identifying potential threats. Maurice gave the example of Onavo and WhatsApp, and prevent them from evolving into an alternative ecosystem. Or we have strategies that involved tying, bundling, and exclusion that prevent other ecosystems from emerging because you, as a control of an ecosystem, deprive a potential ecosystem from access to some essential resources. And the last thing, which I personally find fascinating, is how the knowledge economy is distorted. We have to appreciate that the deep pockets of these tech barons enable them, to flood the market with research that is focusing on certain types of innovation. It enables them to make use of public resources. And here we discuss this with Celia Recap and make reference to her empirical research into the way in which patents that rely on studies that were combined by industry and universities, the patents eventually go to the companies rather than the universities. So the ability to commercialize and extract knowledge from the public sphere. And what we have is a knowledge economy that we assume that it operates like a market, but in a way it is distorted because it as well, just like the innovation paths, it starts to lean toward those tech giants. It leans toward the value proposition that they make. The grants are linked to their projects, and everything also in the public sphere starts to gravitate toward their ecosystems. So because of that, what we see is a distortion that flows beyond the ecosystem. And when you see that distortion, you start to appreciate that what we're talking about is not a static analysis of where we are at present. The story is not the story of market power and distortion of competition. The story is a distortion of the future, distortion of the futuristic paths. And if you want to get a sense of what that distortion feels like, then you can look, for example, on the effects on plurality, and the effects on the nature of innovation. So to give you a sense of plurality, what we mean by that, the ecosystems, the tech barons, what they do is, in a sense, they limit the plurality of innovation. They make sure that only the innovation that is complementary to their value chains will reach the market. Because they do so, the future is very narrow in terms of development. Things that are linked to technologies are somehow linked to their value propositions. What is the risk? If we look at history, what you have here is just illustration of the period of the golden age of Islam in Baghdad. And Baghdad in the 8th century became really the center of innovation, global innovation. a lot of the math that we use today, the science, our understanding of life is based on innovations that emerged from that era. And what was so unique about Baghdad in that period? The fact that it had plurality. Everyone were welcome into Baghdad. It didn't matter the religion, it didn't matter the background. It was all about what can you contribute to our understanding of astronomy, of mathematics, of biology, of medicine. And that golden age ended toward the end when the regime and the religious clerics there started to narrow the entry gates into Baghdad. No, people were not welcome anymore. What you had is a situation where little by little, the innovation paths were narrowed. And the natural result was that the center of innovation, global innovation, just shifted elsewhere. But if you take that example and you bring it now to our internet digital arena, we have nowhere else to shift innovation because we're talking about the global phenomena. So when those that hold the power are able to distort the paths of innovation, this has a real impact on us. Another effect that we have to acknowledge is the link between market power and the value of innovation. And Maurice mentioned that at the beginning, because what happens is that whereas we often assume that innovation that is delivered to the market reflects our desires, this is very far from reality. In reality, as you gain market power, you can start foster innovation that is disconnected from our desires. And indeed, the value of innovation decreases from innovation that creates value, innovation that benefits us, to patents that are aimed at extracting value from us. And we went through a long process of reviewing patent registrations and looking at the different type of innovations. And what you see is that the more market power you have, the more freedom you have to advance innovation, where you don't look at the consumers and users, but actually you look at your value chain. A nice example is Zuckerberg in the early days of Facebook, when they downgraded privacy and there was a lot of controversy. He came out with an apology, public apology, says we were wrong, we will never do that again. You will not come across a similar statement today, because today the customers are the advertisers and those who want to target us. The providers are the ecosystems and the tech barons. The value chain is all about extracting value from us. And we, because we don't pay in monetary sense, we pay with data, time, and privacy, we are not part of the equation that really affect the nature of innovation. Maurice, you want to
quantify this, what we looked at is how much does Facebook make per user? And what you can see just in this chart is that in the US and Canada, Facebook was making in the fourth quarter of 2011, on average, $3.20 per user. And then that increased in 2020 to $53. And you have to then wonder, what is your value that you're getting from Facebook? And has it increased 5 or 6-fold over that time period? Yeah, you're getting some extra benefits from Facebook, but it's unlikely that the value you're receiving from Facebook is commensurate with the increase in value that Facebook is making off of you. We go then to the next slide, and we can look then at the ripple effects that the toxic innovation has. And here, just to highlight, you might think, oh, I can avoid the tech baron, but you're not likely going to avoid the effects of the toxic innovation, because in order to addict us, in order to attract us, that the innovation has a way then of driving people apart through tribalism and rancor. And again, here we're relying on internal studies by some of the tech barons themselves, where they recognize the negative effects that their technology is having on society as well as democracy. So if we go then to the next slide, we can then ask, well, what about antitrust? I mean, antitrust historically was to rein in the monopolies. why hasn't antitrust worked in reining in the tech barons? And part of the problem is what's called CSI analysis. And if we go to the next slide, CSI, and you could see this with the case that was brought against Apple by Epic Games, is the courts have taken a statute that was meant to prevent restraints that tend to create a monopoly, and gave the sort of benefit to the plaintiff or the antitrust enforcer, and now have changed it in such a way that the plaintiff has to quantify first that the company is a monopoly, and then second, to quantify the anti-competitive effects, to show this is how it's likely causing harm to consumers with either higher prices or reduced output. And this has been particularly problematic in mergers and acquisitions, where it's very hard for the antitrust enforcer to say, well, what's the impact that Facebook will have on WhatsApp users when the price of WhatsApp is not going to go up? In fact, there was a nominal fee that was eliminated. Prices go down. So CSI really works against reining in the tech barons. That's why a lot of the tech barons like CSI antitrust and want to keep the status quo. But if CSI is not going to rein them in, let's go then to the next slide and look at some of the regulations. And so, Ariel, I mean, I know we have only a few minutes left, but what's some of the regulations and on reining them in?
Yeah, so there is an impressive shopping list if you look in all corners of the globe. In Europe, of course, we have the DMA, we have the forthcoming DSA. You have in the US a long list of proposals in the pipeline. Now, there is a whole debate of what will be the success of some of them actually reaching the position where they can be implemented. We will skip that because we don't have time. But the debate that is interesting is to think, let's say that we are benefiting from all of these regulations. Do we actually, or did we actually manage to put our finger on the issues that are now distorting the paths of innovation? Now, needless to say, some of the items in those acts and regulations will certainly have an impact, a positive impact. There are some regulations that deal with dark patterns, that deal with exclusions. So certainly there is a positive impact. But we're using the analogy of duck hunting to explain what is the problem with the current approach. When you hunt ducks, and I personally never hunted ducks, but the analogy is quite fitting. You don't aim at the duck. You aim ahead of the duck because this is where the duck is heading. And this is how you manage to actually hit the duck. What the regulation and the proposals that we have at the moment are predominantly doing is aim at the duck. And what we have are companies that are much more sophisticated than ducks, because those companies are aware that we're aiming at them. So not only are they changing the path in which they move, but also they move much faster. So a lot of the regulations that we have now suffer from a very significant problem. They take a shopping list of past violations and they assume that if we address those violations, we will address the problems of the future. What we warn against is that this static analysis doesn't go to the core of the problem and doesn't really resolve the key issues when it comes to innovation. It will help, no doubt, but it will not resolve it. So Maurice, do you want very briefly to take us through this slide?
Sure. So where we are right now is on the left-hand side of the screen, where antitrust enforcers look at the effects of restraints in narrowly defined antitrust markets, and they really look at it through the prism of price and output. That's changing. And so what Ariel talked about is you go to the current policy proposals, and it's an improvement. And so we're not against the DSA, the DMA, and the legislation before Congress. In fact, we argue that it's helpful over the current CSI antitrust. because rather than just focusing on narrowly defined markets, at least now they're focusing on platforms, and there are more presumptions, less of a need to define relevant market, less of a need to offset restraints with pro-competitive business justifications. It is an improvement over the status quo, but it's not where we need to go. So what we argue is you have to go one step further. And competition officials haven't gone there. They often look at what the tech barons do, but they don't ask, why do the tech barons behave the way that they do? What causes them to act that? Not that they're bad people. A lot of well-meaning people have gone into big tech. So when we go then to the next screen, what we then have are three takeaway questions. And here is, does the innovation create, destroy, or extract value? And if it creates value, who's getting the value? If you're hearing the questions like, well, we don't have to worry about it because markets determine that, that's false. And after reading our book and looking at the studies that we cite, that becomes clear. Second is, what are the incentives? And we can't assume that the tech barons' incentives are aligned with our incentives. And then third, how do we get the diversity? How do we get a diversity of disruptive technologies? And these three takeaway questions lead us then to the way forward, where we identify three principles that policymakers should consider. So we can't give a defined roadmap of saying, this is what you need to do, and here's the formula in order to increase innovation in the digital economy. Instead, we outline the following three principles: the importance of value, what's the value of innovation? Second, the incentives, we talked about that. And third, and Ariel brought about this, is the importance of plurality and diversity. And in order to then effectuate these three principles, we rely on two sets of policies. First, Ariel, do you want to talk briefly about the optimization policies?
Yeah, so if you imagine optimization policies here, we use the analogy of a switchboard, where we have so many laws, and what we need to do is, when you think about competition law, IP, data protection, privacy, all of those switches just need to be adjusted in a way that takes into account the principles. So this is one approach where you look at the legal system, the framework. The other approach is to look at proactive actions and policies that are advanced by the state. And here, of course, we have taxation, we have subsidies, we have funding, but there's also, and maybe Maurice, you want to end with that, there's also a really interesting idea that we advanced toward the end of the book, which is the role of cities as hubs for innovation.
Right. So Ariel and I have been doing this now for over 2 decades, right? And there's not many things that surprise us, particularly when you start writing a book. But this was something that actually floored us. And we never heard about it before. And we were wondering, and we've looked around, and it doesn't, we haven't heard any antitrust policymaker mention this. Typically, when we think about innovation, we say, well, who are the innovators? And we think, oh, companies. Companies are the ones who innovate, so let's invest in companies. And in order to invest in companies, let's give them tax subsidies so that they come into our city, because once they come into our city, they're going to then innovate and the population will benefit. So you can see then in the United States how all these different cities were competing for Amazon to have its second headquarters located in its city. Because the belief was, if we attract Amazon, we're going to attract innovation. But that's not the case. And there is this book by Geoffrey West called Scale. And he came upon this brilliant insight, is that as cities become bigger, even if they don't have a tech baron in them, as cities become bigger and double in population, the number of patents increase by more than 100%. It's actually 1.15. So cities scale superlinearly when it comes to innovation. That means as the city doubles in size, you're likely to get more than twice the number of patents. Companies, when they double in size, you'll get more patents, but fewer. So they scale sublinearly. That means, like, let's say a company doubles in size, you might get less than 100% more patents. And what this means is that rather investing in companies, we should be investing in cities. But some cities perform better than others. And a lot more needs to be determined about why some cities do better in generating R&D than others. But you see this also about regional industry clusters. So one of the key takeaways that we want from, in hearing our talk is when you hear a policymaker say, we will invest in innovation by attracting this company, is your response to say, well, why shouldn't we be investing in the city itself, in infrastructure, so that we can attract a diversity of innovators? Won't we be better off as a result of that? So that's just one of the key takeaways that we have in our book to get you thinking about it.
Okay, I think we'll end with that. Thank you so much.